Welcome to Vertical Integration Part 2, where we cover Michael Porter's From Competitive Advantage to Corporate Strategy. First, let's look at vertical integration in a easy-to-understand company, Zara. So Zara, very simple. They're stores, and they sell to customers who, I guess in this picture, look fabulous. What's interesting about Zara is that unlike any other clothing company that I can think of, they actually make their own clothes. Okay, so they're actually in the sweatshop industry. Typically, companies subcontract out and work with sweatshop owners. And Zara, on the other hand, actually owns their own factories and produces their own clothes. We'll talk about why strategically, because compare, for obvious reasons, Zara is the biggest clothing company in the world. The number 2 clothing company, H&M, doesn't do any of their own production. They buy from manufacturers throughout the world. Why does Zara own their own factories? So Porter asked this question, why integrate vertically at all? And of course, we give a standard response: to improve performance and add to shareholder value. So the reason you integrate vertically, and what actually improves performance, is synergies, that is, gains from integration. So there are exactly 2 types of synergy. Every synergy has to fit in to one of these 2 synergies. Number 1, cost cutting. So when 2 companies merge, or when 2 business units are created, that one has to allow the other to cut costs. When 2 companies merge, for example, they tend to say, we're going to reduce human resources count, or we're going to cut the accounting function. The second is cross-unit performance. So this is actual synergies where one company allows the other one to sell something that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to sell. So think like an enterprise software. They already have a sales team. They can go out and sell it when the sales team is talking to their customers. Pharmaceuticals, a pharma rep, if the pharma company buys another drug, the pharma rep can then sell to the network that there is already existing. So that's kind of an easy example of cross-unit performance or revenue synergies. So why shouldn't you integrate, right? That all sounds fine and dandy, but you shouldn't integrate for all the other reasons. In general, you shouldn't be integrating. The classic reason is that diversification adds costs and constraints to the business unit. So that's why you don't see pizza joints buying gas stations and companies engaging in lots of unrelated diversifications or integrations. Okay, so Zara, what are the synergies? Zara is known for their fast fashion, so the factories allow them to get the new styles into Zara stores more quickly. Zara's factories are far more costly than buying from your more traditional sweatshop style factories throughout the rest of the world. It allows them to get fashion to the stores quickly. It allows them to control quantity so that they don't overmake something that consumers aren't necessarily interested in. So for our main application of Porter's 3 tests, we are going to look at Unilever's decision to buy Ben & Jerry's. So we'll ask the question, which Unilever asked back in 2000, should they buy the Ben & Jerry's ice cream brand? And there's some vocab here. In this case, if Unilever is buying Ben & Jerry's, Unilever becomes the acquirer, and Ben & Jerry's becomes the target. So the target of the acquisition. So when looking at this with Michael Porter, we ask 3 questions. Test number 1, industry attractiveness. Is the target industry attractive? Now let's go back. Ben & Jerry's is the target. So when we ask, is the target industry attractive, we're asking, is the ice cream industry attractive? If you're like most of my students, you initially say, is Ben & Jerry's an attractive company? No. No. We're asking, is the industry that Ben & Jerry's is located in attractive as an industry to invest in? When Michael Porter asks you to do an industry analysis, he asks you to do a 5 forces analysis. So for our purposes today, we're going to do a 5 forces test. And since we said that the target industry is the ice cream industry in the year 2000 here in America, threat from suppliers, pretty low. Right? Your suppliers are dairy and sugar. They don't have a strategic threat or a strategic way to hurt your business or profits. Threat from buyers, also low. While buyers can easily pick a different brand, you could buy Haagen-Dazs, you could buy Ben& Jerry's, it doesn't mean that the buyers are purchasing in such big quantities that they can demand even lower prices. So buyers are a relatively low threat in this context. Threat of new entrants in the year 2000 is moderate. There are a lot of companies were still coming into the market. In fact, in the year 2020, we're still seeing new entrants to this market. So it certainly can't be a low threat. The threat from substitutes is high. The ice cream industry, anything can be a substitute. In the dessert space, so a brownie can be a substitute. Sorbet, gelato, molten lava cake, cheesecake, whatever floats your boat dessert-wise. So there are a lot of substitutes out there. And then the intensity of competition, perhaps moderate to high. And there are other brands, but brand does matter. So that, I see high here. Perhaps moderate is a better answer. So we'll summarize that in a second. I'll give you my aggregate thoughts. Test number 2, cost of entry. So Michael Porter asks, does the cost of entry capitalize all future earnings? In other words, is the project NPV positive? And really, from a layman's perspective, we just want to ask, is our investment, return on investment, going to be higher than our cost of capital? So it's not reflective of actual dollar amounts. In other words, if you invest $10 billion and you make $200 million, it's not a great return, actually. If you invest $1 billion and make $200 million, fantastic return. So it's not about the amount of money, it's about the percent return on your investment. Okay, so I'm doing a pro forma P&L. I don't have a lot of information, but what we're setting up is what would the return have to be in order to make this a good decision for Unilever. So cost of Ben& Jerry's in 2000, Unilever offered a bid for about $350 million. Ben& Jerry's was publicly traded, so it's a very simple transaction. And I'm pulling this number out of thin air. Let's say that Unilever's weighted average cost of capital in the year 2000 was 12%. So essentially, we want to make sure that in the long run, we can earn a 12% return on this investment. So what would the required income need to be from Ben& Jerry's to make it worthwhile from a financial standpoint? That's the key idea of this second test, the financial standpoint. And so what I got when multiplying 350 million times 12%, so just to see what the hurdle might be per year, is can Ben& Jerry's earn 42 million in profits? Easy, right? Yeah, sure, totally. Can Ben & Jerry's earn $42 million in profits? Not necessarily in the first year, but in the long run, by year 7, by year 8. Can they earn $42 million? And that's actually quite interesting because Ben & Jerry's at the time only had $237 million in annual revenues. And while their annual revenues were growing quickly, they weren't growing at some kind of astronomical .com rate. So $42 million of profit on $237 million of revenues. The company's going to have to grow over time, at least in line with inflation once they meet their target. Test number 1 had us look into the industry to see if the industry itself was attractive. Test number 2 looked at the financials of the deal to see if the profitability of the deal was attractive. And test number 3 is telling us to look at the synergies between the two companies. We ask what specific strategy mechanisms are at play. How can synergies be realized? How does the acquisition improve, Unilever's competitive position, but also Ben & Jerry's competitive position? But how does it improve Unilever's competitive position? So you need to ask 2 questions. It's essentially the same question, and then it gets reversed. And so the first iteration of this question asks, will the target business be better off due to being bought by the acquirer? In English, this means, will Ben & Jerry's be better off after being bought by Unilever? Okay, yeah. What is Ben & Jerry's going to lose? Going into a corporate environment is going to take a bunch of aging creative hippies, and it's probably going to dampen their creativity a bit. But what do they get access to by being bought by Unilever? They get access to Unilever's marketing, capital, and distribution network. And the latter, the distribution network, may be the most important because Ben & Jerry's is on a lot of shelves throughout supermarkets. But imagine if they're on Unilever's distribution network. They could be on a lot of shelves throughout the US and Canada, Mexico, Europe, almost overnight. They can get access probably to better suppliers or cheaper supply routes. So it's probably net a pretty good deal for Ben & Jerry's as a company. Not Ben & Jerry's financially, but Ben & Jerry's as a strategic entity to be bought by Unilever. Now we flip that and we ask, how does Unilever fare after all of this? So will the acquirer be better off after paying usually a high premium for the target? So will the acquirer be better off after paying a high premium? In other words, you're not getting Ben & Jerry's at a reasonable price. Unilever is spending a lot, a huge premium to get Ben & Jerry's. So will they be better off? Ben & Jerry's is probably a great bet at $100 million. Is it a great bet at $350 million? Would it be a good bet at $1 billion? It's a purely financial consideration. Unilever doesn't get any brand benefits from Ben & Jerry's. It's Unilever. Let's give an example of something that clearly passes both sides of the better off. Google bought Android software back in about 2008. And how did Google come out after that? Well, Google benefited from the software. It was a critical piece of the technology that they needed to get a mobile operating system out to compete with Apple's recent introduction of iOS. So for Google, it's a pretty big, pretty strong benefit. And from Android, strategically, let's say the engineering team at Android, access to Google's resources and the ability to get distributed, so to speak, to all the smartphones out there that were going to run Android allowed them to get the software up and running and onto millions of phones and ultimately billions of phones. So that was a case where both sides benefited rather quickly from a strategic perspective from the acquisition. So what do we think about the Ben & Jerry's deal? Industry attractive. Yes, the industry is attractive enough. And I think in 2020, it's proven to be even a more attractive industry. So I think test number one is passed. Cost of entry, they paid $350 million for it, and Ben & Jerry's, as expected, has grown. It's almost 3 times bigger than it was in the year 2000. They don't release profit figures anymore because it's part of Unilever. I wonder, I think it's possible that they could make money. Remember that $42 million that we discussed? It's possible that they could make $42 million from a $650 million in revenue. But it's possible. And then better off. So yeah, I mean, I think in general, certainly from Ben & Jerry's perspective, which is why I picked this example, I think that Ben & Jerry's is absolutely better off being bought by Unilever. The synergies were reasonably strong. Generally pretty positive. I think this is certainly an example of one of the more successful deals of this type of the past 20 years. So last slide for us. There's 3 examples to send you on your way of great vertical integrations. One is quite recent, Disney building Disney Plus. So Disney is an entertainment production company. And when they released Disney Plus, they created a new distribution platform on the web. And that took all of the iconic Disney products and allowed them to get into people's homes pretty easily. So I think that's a pretty strong one. Apple, way back in the early 2000s, when Steve Jobs recognized that they needed to build Apple stores to showcase the luxuriness of their products and service. Genius Bar offer their own customer service. And finally, Netflix. It's another big one from the past 10 years. Netflix built their own production capabilities. So they did the distribution. Netflix was a platform that you could go on to watch movies, but they started producing their own content, both in-house and purchasing from other production companies. All right. Thanks so much.